Picture this. I'm barely out of my rental truck when a woman in an electric blue power suit approaches my driveway like she's serving divorce papers. The engine hadn't even cooled down from my cross-country drive when Patricia, the homeowners association chief, materialized with a clipboard thick as a dictionary and attitude sharp enough to cut steel. My name is David, and before I could even grab my first box, Patricia had slapped a $450 citation on my windshield for 17 separate infractions. Mailbox positioning, lawn specifications, welcome mat compliance. She'd probably fine me for blinking incorrectly if she found the right regulation. Standing there reeking of expensive perfume and authority complex, she informed me I had 48 hours to pay $950 or face property liens. But here's what made me grin. Patricia had zero clue she'd just declared war on the person who actually owned her rental property. What would you do if an HOA dictator ambushed you before you'd unpacked your coffee maker? Where are you watching from? And what's your most outrageous HOA experience? Let me rewind and explain how I landed in this suburban battlefield. 4 months ago, I was managing retail properties in Denver when corporate decided my entire division was expendable. 2 decades of maximizing their profits, and they handed me a termination letter with security watching. The final insult came when my ex-wife announced she was keeping our house and shacking up with her meditation guru, some guy called Moonbeam who peddles healing, stones at weekend markets. When Great Aunt Dorothy's attorney contacted me about inheriting her Colorado home, it seemed like divine intervention. Dorothy was my grandmother's younger sister, a petite powerhouse who could repair engines and organize charity drives simultaneously. After Uncle Robert died in the service, she raised 4 children solo, worked midnight shifts at the factory, and still managed to care for every homeless animal in a 10-block area. Here's what 2 decades in property management taught me. Always examine the fine print, particularly with homeowner associations. HOAs function like miniature governments with corruption potential, but minimal accountability. Important fact: HOA board members carry fiduciary responsibilities similar to corporate executives, making them personally liable for financial misconduct. Remember this detail. It becomes crucial later. The property occupied a prime corner lot in Maplewood Gardens, a 53-home development that began modestly in 1981, but evolved into something pretentious over the decades. Now it's where people drive luxury vehicles but split restaurant tabs down to the penny. Monthly association fees had mysteriously inflated to $195, allegedly covering grounds maintenance, pool upkeep, and community standards enforcement. Which sounds exactly as threatening as it proved to be. I should have recognized trouble when the lawyer mentioned Dorothy had ongoing disputes with the homeowners association, but honestly, I assumed it was typical senior citizen friction. Maybe she planted daisies instead of approved flowers or committed the unforgivable sin of displaying garden decorations. So there I was, August heat making the pavement smell like burning rubber, when Patricia emerged from her pristine silver Lexus like some suburban enforcement robot. This woman embodied peak, her authority figure, someone who peaked as prom queen in 1985 and spent decades trying to reclaim that power. Her designer athletic wear cost more than most people's mortgage payments, and she wore a professional camera around her neck like she was documenting war zones instead of property violations. She began circling my truck with predatory focus, that camera clicking faster than a radiation detector near a nuclear plant. The sound triggered my headaches. Then she produced these pre-printed violation forms, professional cardstock with embossed letterhead and my name already inscribed in elegant script. This wasn't spontaneous authoritarianism. This was calculated bureaucratic assault. Commercial vehicles are strictly forbidden in residential areas, she declared, indicating the faded business decals on my pickup. Irrelevant that it was my personal vehicle. Apparently, having Denver Property Management on the door classified you as an environmental threat. Unauthorized landscaping alterations detected, she continued, gesturing theatrically at Great Aunt Dorothy's rose garden. These magnificent red climbers that had flourished since Reagan's presidency were suddenly criminal because nobody had filed Form 31C with the sacred Board of Visual Harmony. Mailbox demonstrates paint deterioration, exceeding community parameters. She actually said paint deterioration like diagnosing terminal illness. The mailbox had perhaps 2 scratches barely noticeable unless you actively searched for flaws. But here's what caught my attention. While she performed this dramatic inspection, neighbors observed from behind window coverings like witnesses to organized crime. These weren't casual onlookers. These people appeared genuinely terrified. An elderly lady across the street slammed her curtains when Patricia glanced over. A man washing his vehicle suddenly discovered urgent tire maintenance needs. That's when Patricia delivered her knockout punch. The previous owner also faced compliance difficulties before her unfortunate demise. The way she said unfortunate chilled my blood. Like Dorothy's death was just another efficiency metric. I maintained composure and requested the HOA regulations and financial documentation. You'd think I'd asked for her browser history and bank records. Suddenly everything required confidential procedures and board authorization. When I casually mentioned my commercial property background, her facade cracked. The sweet smile flickered, revealing something predatory beneath. She promised appropriate enforcement measures and clicked away in her heels, leaving me with $1,950 in fraudulent fines and the clear impression I'd been marked for elimination. But Patricia didn't know one crucial detail. I don't just manage properties, I own them, including the one she calls home. The following morning brought a certified letter wedged in my door like a mob contract. Patricia had escalated overnight with professional-grade psychological warfare that would impress Pentagon strategists. This wasn't merely a violation notice. This was comprehensive legal assault wrapped in HOA letterhead and sealed with bureaucratic malice. The letter demanded immediate payment of all fines, now mysteriously inflated to $2,640, thanks to administrative processing fees and overnight penalties that multiplied like bacterial growth. She'd included timestamp photographs from every angle, professional documentation that would make forensic investigators envious, and lean threats within 30 days. She'd copied everyone from the management company to some attorney whose specialty seemed to be foreclosing on charities. But Patricia made her first tactical error. She assumed I was another intimidated homeowner who'd surrender faster than a golden retriever. What she didn't realize was that 20 years managing commercial properties teaches you one essential survival skill: how to read the fine print. Everyone else ignores like software terms and conditions. So I did what any reasonable person would do. Drove straight to the county records office. If you've never experienced this particular bureaucratic nightmare, imagine the DMV's more dysfunctional relative. Fluorescent lighting that makes everyone look like zombie extras. Musty smell of aged paperwork mixed with crushed dreams, and clerks who act like you personally destroyed every filing cabinet in existence. But county records are public documents, meaning Patricia's little empire had to follow actual regulations instead of whatever she scribbled during wine nights. What I discovered was juicier than reality television scandals. The original 1985 HOA charter resembled Patricia's current regulations about as much as a bicycle resembles a fighter aircraft. The original document was perhaps 10 pages of reasonable neighbor guidelines. Maintain your yard decently. Don't paint your house like a circus tent. Don't operate a used car dealership from your driveway. But somehow over the years, this sensible document had transformed into a 43-page authoritarian manifesto covering everything, from approved holiday decorations to acceptable pet exercise routes. I remembered reading that most HOA rule modifications require actual homeowner approval. If those votes never occurred, the new rules carry approximately the same legal authority as a chocolate teapot. Even better, Great Aunt Dorothy's property had special grandfathered protection for landscaping. Those roses Patricia was having seizures about were specifically protected under the original charter as existing mature vegetation. Her violation notice was about as legally binding as a grocery receipt, but the real treasure was buried in the HOA financial records. As a property owner, I had complete access rights. What I found made my commercial property manager brain calculate faster than supercomputer processors. Numbers that didn't reconcile, expenses more inflated than parade balloons, and a budget that appeared designed by someone who learned accounting from fortune cookies. That's when Helen appeared. And I mean appeared like some neighborhood intelligence guardian angel. This 76-year-old retired librarian had been observing me from across the street and apparently decided I looked trustworthy enough for serious neighborhood. "Intelligence, you're investigating the HOA," she whispered. glancing around like we were planning prison breaks. Excellent. Someone needs to. The folder Helen handed me was thick enough to stop bullets. She'd been documenting Patricia's reign of terror with methodical precision, worthy of someone who'd spent 4 decades organizing information professionally. 14 families targeted in 18 months, all following identical patterns. Excessive fines, impossible deadlines, forced sales below market value, and whose real estate agency kept securing those listings. 3 guesses, and the first 2 don't count. 4 elderly residents had already been bulldozed from their homes. Mrs. Chen got cited for a mailbox post that leaned perhaps 3 degrees off vertical. The Martinez family was fined for excessive children's equipment because their kids dared leave a tricycle visible from the sidewalk. Mr. Thompson, a Navy veteran, got penalized because his American flag was allegedly improperly sized for his flagpole. That afternoon, Patricia returned with reinforcement. Her boyfriend, Kevin, sporting some fake security credentials he'd probably ordered from the same place mall guards buy uniforms. They demanded interior access to inspect for internal covenant violations, which was apparently legitimate in Patricia's imaginary legal universe. I politely refused, citing minor details like the Fourth Amendment and basic property rights. Kevin started photographing through my windows like some discount private investigator, which prompted me to drop my first hint. Interesting detail, I announced loud enough for neighbors to hear. The HOA budget shows $35,000 in landscaping expenses, but the actual contractor only received $12,000. Makes you wonder where that other $23,000 ended up. The silence was so complete you could hear dust particles settling. Patricia cycled through more colors than a malfunctioning traffic light, and Kevin suddenly remembered urgent business elsewhere. They retreated to their Lexus faster than vampires from sunlight, but not before Patricia promised serious legal consequences for my harassment and intimidation. I just smiled and waved friendly. After all, I was just warming up. Patricia's response to my accounting question was swift and about as subtle as a sledgehammer through glass. The next morning, I'm enjoying coffee and watching sunrise when a city inspection truck arrives. Out steps this apologetic inspector who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else in the universe. Received a complaint about an abandoned commercial vehicle, he says, checking his clipboard with the enthusiasm of someone reading obituaries. He examines my perfectly legal pickup, finds absolutely nothing wrong, and apologizes for wasting everyone's time. But before leaving, he leans close. Anonymous tip came in at 5:30 a.m. Caller knew your exact address and vehicle description. Pretty specific for someone just driving by. 2 hours later, the state contractor licensing board called. Apparently someone had filed complaints claiming I was operating unlicensed business from my residence. The investigator was professional but required asking, was I running Denver property management from my Colorado address? I explained that I'd relocated, wasn't operating any business, and the decals were remnants from my previous employment. Case closed in 5 minutes, but the message was crystal clear. Patricia was playing hardball. That night, around 1:30 a.m., I heard footsteps on gravel outside. Living alone develops excellent hearing for sounds that don't belong. And these definitely didn't belong. I peeked through blinds just in time to see a silver Lexus creeping past like some suburban stalker vehicle. Next morning, my mailbox was decorated with spray paint. Nothing obscene. Just random marks designed to create another violation. There was also a delightful pile of dog waste on my front steps, positioned with precision suggesting this wasn't random canine artistic expression. Good thing I'd installed security cameras the previous day. Property management teaches paranoia. Too many tenants who consider security deposits optional rather than mandatory. The footage was beautiful. Patricia's Lexus circling at 1:43 a.m., clear shots of her license plate, and Kevin skulking around my property like the world's least competent ninja. But while Patricia was playing amateur vandal, I was diving deeper into the HOA's financial rabbit hole. What I found was more twisted than a pretzel factory explosion. Remember the landscaping discrepancy? That was appetizer. The pool maintenance contract was the real masterpiece. $750 monthly for a community pool that's maybe 25 feet long and sees about as much use as a snowball in Phoenix. I contacted actual pool services for quotes. Market rate was closer to $180, but Elite Aquatic Services was apparently worth quadruple the standard rate, despite the pool looking like a science experiment gone wrong. Green water, floating debris like lily pads, and smell suggesting something had expired during Bush Sr.'s presidency. The landscaping contract was even better. $2,800 monthly for comprehensive grounds maintenance consisting of mowing 53 tiny front yards and trimming hedges. I've managed shopping centers with smaller maintenance budgets. But Summit Landscaping was clearly providing premium services if you counted showing up twice monthly and operating a mower for an hour as premium. Then there were the legal fees. $18,000 annually for routine compliance enforcement. Most HOAs spend maybe $1,500 yearly on legal issues, and that's when actually dealing with serious problems. But apparently enforcing mailbox height regulations required legal firepower, usually reserved for corporate acquisitions. My investigation was attracting neighborhood allies. Frank, a Marine veteran with hands that looked like they'd rebuilt half of America's machinery, knocked on my door one evening with beer and interesting observations. Maria, a single mother working as a paralegal, offered legal research assistance. Even Reverend Johnson from the nearby church stopped by expressing support. Apparently, Patricia had tried getting the church cited for excessive parking during Sunday services, but Patricia wasn't finished with her amateur intimidation campaign. She filed police reports claiming I'd aggressively confronted her and made threatening statements about her finances. Officer Martinez arrived looking like he'd rather chase actual criminals. Took one look at my security footage and quickly realized he was dealing with bogus complaints. Word of advice, he said quietly while leaving. Document everything. I've seen this pattern before, and it usually escalates before it improves. That's when Patricia made her biggest mistake yet. She actually demanded Officer Martinez arrest me for disturbing peace and intimidating a public official. Apparently being HOA president now qualified as public service. The officer's response was professional, but firm. Ma'am, questioning HOA finances isn't criminal. Making false police reports, however, is. As Martinez drove away and Patricia stomped back to her Lexus, I realized something important. I wasn't just dealing with a petty tyrant anymore. I was dealing with someone genuinely desperate. People don't escalate this rapidly unless they have something serious to hide. And hiding in Great Aunt Dorothy's attic, I was about to discover exactly what that something was. Patricia's desperation hit maximum velocity when she called an emergency HOA board meeting with exactly 24 hours notice, which violates bylaws requiring 72 hours minimum. But desperate people don't read fine print. They just bulldoze ahead hoping nobody notices their legal train wreck. The meeting was held in Patricia's living room, which immediately felt like being summoned to the principal's office, except the principal wore yoga pants and burned vanilla candles. She'd arranged furniture like a courtroom with herself behind this massive oak desk that probably cost more than most people's vehicles. The agenda, printed on her real estate company letterhead, had exactly one item: emergency lien proceedings against 1435 Oak Street. Only 3 of 5 board members appeared. Apparently the others had suddenly developed mysterious scheduling conflicts. Without a quorum, they couldn't legally vote on anything more consequential than donut flavors. But Patricia plowed ahead anyway, like a freight train with failed brakes. That's when Helen appeared in the doorway like some avenging librarian angel. This woman who'd been terrorized into submission for months suddenly found her voice and started citing Robert's Rules of Order like reciting poetry. Point of order. You cannot conduct official business without a quorum. This meeting is procedurally invalid. Patricia's mask finally slipped completely. She screamed at Helen, actually screamed, calling her a meddling busybody and threatening to fine her for disrupting official proceedings. The transformation was spectacular. Suburban princess to raging tyrant in approximately 3 seconds. While Patricia was having her public meltdown, I'd been having my private breakthrough. Maria's paralegal skills had uncovered something that made my property management experience tingle with recognition. Shell company connections more tangled than Christmas lights in a tornado. Summit Landscaping wasn't just some random contractor. It was owned by Patricia's nephew, a 24-year-old whose previous employment consisted of working at GameStop and getting terminated from pizza delivery. Elite Aquatic Services belonged to Kevin, who apparently learned pool maintenance from YouTube videos and Optimism, and Legal Solutions LLC. That was Patricia's college roommate's law firm, specializing in what I'm generously calling creative interpretations of HOA regulations. Every single vendor was connected to Patricia's family or social circle, all charging rates that would make luxury resorts blush. I'd seen this exact scam in commercial properties. Board members steering contracts to friends and family while skimming, profits like running some suburban crime syndicate. But the real smoking gun came when I started comparing violation patterns across the neighborhood. Remember how I mentioned Patricia's selective enforcement? It wasn't random. It was surgical. She systematically targeted elderly residents, single parents, and anyone who appeared vulnerable to intimidation. The Williams got cited for having a non-regulation garden gnome, while the mansion 3 houses down had actual code violations that never appeared on any inspection report. My informal coffee meetings at Betty's Diner were evolving into underground resistance gatherings. 21 residents attended the latest one, sharing horror stories that painted a picture of systematic harassment. Mrs. Rodriguez described how Patricia had fined her for excessive memorial decorations after placing a small flag for her late husband's military service. The Jackson family got cited for their children's sidewalk chalk drawings lasting beyond acceptable temporary duration. Apparently, children's art was now a covenant violation. Frank's engineering assessment of community infrastructure was the final nail in Patricia's coffin. This man had constructed bridges in Vietnam and maintained factory equipment for 40 years. When he said something was wrong, you listened. His report read like forensic accounting nightmare. Thousands of dollars charged for road repairs that never occurred, drainage work existing only on paper, and a security system consisting of exactly one broken camera aimed at a maple tree. That's when Patricia went nuclear. She hired a private investigator, probably someone from the same discount detective agency where Kevin got his fake badge, to dig up dirt on my background. The rumors started flying faster than gossip at church potlucks. My military discharge was supposedly dishonorable. It wasn't. I was gang-affiliated because I'd lived in Denver. Apparently, every Colorado resident is automatically suspect. And my great-aunt had left me the house because I was blackmailing her, which would be impressive considering she'd been deceased when I allegedly started. The racial undertones weren't subtle. Patricia was exploiting every suburban fear she could imagine, painting me as some outside agitator come to destroy their precious community. She created fake social media accounts to spread these lies because nothing says credible neighborhood leader like anonymous internet trolling. But while she was busy constructing her house of lies, I was building my house of evidence. Every meeting, every violation, every suspicious financial transaction was documented with obsessive detail that would make FBI forensic accountants weep with joy. Then Patricia played her final desperate card. A certified letter claiming I owed $43,000 in special assessments for improvements including a new playground, upgraded security system, and road repairs. None of these improvements actually existed, but payment was due in 10 days or my property would be liened. I read that letter twice, then started laughing. Patricia had just handed me exactly the kind of overreach. I'd been waiting for time to show her what happens when you pick fights with someone who actually knows how to read contracts. The court ordered. Financial records arrived on a Tuesday, morning that smelled like rain and revolution. My attorney had worked legal magic, and suddenly Patricia's carefully guarded secrets were spread across my dining room table like crime scene evidence. What I found made 20 years of property management fraud cases look like amateur hour at community theater over. $280,000 had vanished from HOA accounts through an elaborate shell game that would have impressed Bernie Madoff. Patricia hadn't just been skimming. She'd been operating a full-scale money laundering operation disguised as community improvement, fake emergency assessments for work existing only in her imagination, invoices for materials never delivered, and payments to contractors who turned out to be her relatives with newly created business licenses. But the real revelation was hiding in property title research. My attorney's office had been thorough, and buried in mineral rights documentation was a detail that made my coffee taste like victory. Great-Aunt Dorothy's property included a small natural gas deposit, Nothing huge, but enough that Rocky Mountain Energy had been paying royalties for 3 years. Royalties that should have been going to the property owner. Royalties that had instead been flowing into the HOA's general fund with Patricia as sole signatory. $16,000 of my money collected and spent without my knowledge or consent. That single fact gave me legal standing to demand complete forensic audit of every HOA transaction since Patricia took power. The safety deposit box key had been hiding in plain sight, tucked inside Great Aunt Dorothy's ancient recipe collection between instructions for apple pie and pot roast. The box contained 5 years of meticulous documentation that would have made federal prosecutors weep with joy. Audio recordings of Patricia admitting to creative accounting and working around those ridiculous financial rules. Copies of forged homeowner signatures on charter amendments never actually voted on, and bank statements showing systematic theft disguised as legitimate expenses. But the final document hit me like a sledgehammer to the chest. Great Aunt Dorothy's last letter, written in her careful handwriting just 2 weeks before she died. David, if you're reading this, then Patricia Whitman has probably tried to destroy what's left of our community. I've gathered everything I could, but I'm too old and tired to fight this battle. Maybe you aren't. The evidence is all here. Make them pay for what they've done to our neighbors. Suddenly, Great Aunt Dorothy's heart attack didn't seem so random. Her medical records, which I'd subpoenaed as part of the property inheritance, showed dangerously elevated blood pressure, starting exactly when Patricia's harassment campaign began. The stress of fighting this corruption had literally killed her, and Patricia had probably celebrated when her biggest obstacle conveniently died. My motivation shifted from personal defense to something much deeper. This wasn't about mailbox heights or lawn violations anymore. This was about honoring the memory of a woman who'd spent her final months trying to protect her neighbors from a predator. The evidence added up to multiple federal crimes, mail fraud, wire fraud, and embezzlement on a scale that would trigger FBI interest. Her real estate license violations were documented in excruciating detail. The total theft approached $420,000 when including inflated contracts, fake assessments, and stolen royalty payments. But the beautiful part was that Patricia had no idea how much evidence existed. She thought she was dealing with one angry homeowner asking inconvenient questions. She had no clue that Great Aunt Dorothy had spent years building an ironclad case against her, or that I now held every piece of that puzzle. The annual HOA meeting was mandatory by law and couldn't be canceled once proper notice was given. 67% of homeowners had to attend for major votes, which meant I needed 36 people in that room. Based on my coffee shop intelligence network, I had commitments from 35 households and counting. Patricia was about to discover that her reign of terror was over. She just didn't know it yet. Great Aunt Dorothy's dining room transformed into something between a war room and FBI field office. I'd pushed her antique table against the wall and covered it with bankers' boxes, legal documents, and a timeline that looked like something from conspiracy thrillers. Red string-connected photographs, financial records, and violation notices in a web that would have made detectives jealous. Helen had appointed herself my chief intelligence officer, bringing homemade cookies and 40 years of librarian organizational skills to the chaos. Maria turned out to be a legal research goddess disguised as a paralegal. She'd spent evenings at the law library, emerging with case precedents and procedural knowledge that my attorney admitted was better than most lawyers could produce. Her dining table was covered with color-coded folders, criminal violations in red, civil damages in blue, procedural violations in yellow. It looked like a rainbow of justice. Building the legal team felt like assembling superheroes if superheroes specialized in HOA fraud instead of fighting aliens. Catherine Reynolds was my primary attorney. 12 years of HOA law experience and a reputation for making corrupt board members cry in depositions. The forensic accountant she recommended could trace money through more shell companies than Russian oligarchs' tax returns. We also had a private investigator specializing in financial crimes and a media consultant who used to produce investigative news segments before going freelance. The state consumer protection attorney offered pro bono support, which told me everything I needed to know about how seriously they took HOA fraud. When government lawyers start volunteering their time, you know you've stumbled onto something bigger than petty neighborhood disputes. Community organizing evolved into a grassroots movement that would have made political campaign managers proud. I went door to door like running for mayor, explaining residents' rights and sharing what I'd discovered about Patricia's financial shell game. The WhatsApp group Maria created grew from 5 people to 41 in 2 weeks, with neighbors sharing evidence photos and supporting each other through decades of accumulated fear. Reverend Johnson offered his church basement for strategy meetings, which gave our rebellion moral authority that Patricia couldn't touch. Frank brought his engineering expertise and started documenting every infrastructure lie Patricia had told. His assessment read like an indictment, claimed road repairs that never happened, drainage work existing only on invoices, and a security system consisting of 1 broken camera aimed at an oak tree. The forensic accountant's investigation was surgical precision applied to financial chaos. Every suspicious transaction got traced through bank records we'd subpoenaed through the Attorney General's office. The pattern was beautiful in its simplicity. Fake invoices led to inflated payments, which flowed through family-owned shell companies before landing in accounts controlled by Patricia and her inner circle. The visual presentation he created looked like a flowchart for organized crime, which wasn't far from truth. Maria prepared enough legal documentation to choke a courthouse. Cease and desist orders for harassment, injunction paperwork to freeze HOA accounts, criminal referral packets from multiple agencies, and class action framework for affected residents. She'd also drafted a homeowner petition to remove Patricia from the board, citing financial mismanagement and breach of fiduciary duty. My media strategy centered around Rachel Thompson, a local newspaper reporter specializing in government corruption stories. She'd been investigating HOA abuse across Colorado and jumped on our story like investigative journalism Christmas morning. The Denver TV affiliate showed interest too, especially after I mentioned the scale of financial fraud and elderly victims forced from their homes. The evidence package grew to 923 pages of financial documents, audio recordings, video evidence, and victim testimony. I'd learned from commercial property days that judges love visual aids, so we created before and after photos showing promised improvements versus actual conditions. The contrast was devastating. Invoices for a playground that didn't exist, bills for roadwork never performed, payments for landscaping that looked maintained by blind people with broken lawnmowers. Practice my presentation with the community theater group meeting at Reverend Johnson's church because nothing prepares you for hostile audiences, like amateur actors critiquing your delivery. They helped me anticipate Patricia's likely responses and develop counter-arguments that would work in front of cameras and legal observers. The technical knowledge I'd shared with other homeowners got compiled into a handbook that Maria designed. HOA Rights and Remedies. Basic information about demanding financial transparency, challenging discriminatory enforcement, and recognizing red flags of board corruption. Most people don't realize HOA boards have the same fiduciary duties as corporate directors, meaning personal liability for financial mismanagement. I remembered reading about a case in Texas where board members had to pay restitution from personal assets after forensic audit revealed systematic theft. The community center reservation was confirmed for the annual meeting with professional recording equipment and legal observers from the Attorney General's office. We'd even arranged media attendance because nothing keeps people honest, like knowing their behavior might end up on evening news. As I sat in Great Aunt Dorothy's kitchen the night before the confrontation, surrounded by evidence of corruption and community support, I felt something I hadn't experienced since military days. The calm confidence that comes from thorough preparation and righteous purpose. Patricia had no idea what was about to hit her. Patricia's reaction to discovering my growing coalition was like watching a cornered animal realize the trap was closing. The neighborhood gossip network, more efficient than any intelligence agency, had apparently informed her that residents were organizing, and her response was to go completely unhinged. First, she tried canceling the annual meeting, claiming security concerns and potential violence from outside agitators. The irony was beautiful. The woman who'd been terrorizing elderly neighbors for years was suddenly worried about her own safety. But Colorado state law is clear about mandatory HOA meetings. Once proper notice is sent, you can't decide democracy is inconvenient and cancel everything. She hired a security company to intimidate residents, which backfired spectacularly when the security manager realized what he was being asked to do. Turns out professional security guards don't appreciate being used as thugs in suburban HOA disputes, especially when the person hiring them can't provide coherent explanation of what threats they're supposed to be protecting against. The rumors Patricia started spreading would have been hilarious if they weren't so desperate. According to the Patricia Whitman Disinformation Network, I was planning violent confrontation that would destroy property values and bring dangerous elements into the community. She apparently told Mrs. Rodriguez that I was organizing gang takeover of the neighborhood, which would have been news to the gang of retired librarians, church volunteers, and military veterans who made up my coalition. Meanwhile, her financial desperation was reaching critical mass. She'd attempted withdrawing the remaining $97,000 from HOA accounts, but the bank had frozen everything pending the Attorney General's investigation. When that failed, she tried destroying financial records, which added obstruction of justice to her growing list of federal crimes. She even attempted bribing the forensic accountant with real estate commissions, apparently not realizing that offering financial incentives to expert witnesses in ongoing investigations is exactly the kind of thing that lands people in federal prison. The personal attacks escalated to stalking behavior that would have made obsessed ex-boyfriends proud. Fake reviews appeared on every professional website I'd ever been associated with, claiming I was violent, unstable, and threatening to peaceful residents. She tried getting my truck registration suspended by filing false DMV reports about unsafe vehicle modifications existing only in her imagination. Kevin started following me to job interviews because, apparently, unemployed property managers are still enough of a threat to require surveillance. Having your HOA president's boyfriend lurking in parking lots while you're trying to rebuild your career adds special flavor of harassment I wouldn't recommend to anyone. But the real escalation came when Patricia showed up at the grocery store where I was shopping, positioning herself at the end of every aisle like some suburban secret agent. When I finally confronted her about it, she claimed she was monitoring potential threats to community safety. The grocery store manager, bless him, informed her that following customers around his store was called stalking, and she needed to leave immediately. The violation notices she sent to coalition members were masterpieces of petty tyranny. Helen got cited for having excessive bird-feeding activity, allegedly attracting undesirable wildlife to the community. Maria received violation for her children's bicycles being improperly stored in her own garage. Frank's military flag got written up for displaying unauthorized colors during non-federal holidays. The elderly residents started receiving anonymous phone calls at all hours with whispered threats about what would happen to troublemakers who didn't mind their own business. When Helen's car windshield mysteriously developed spiderweb crack overnight, the message was clear. Patricia was willing to escalate to property damage to maintain control. Maria found dead flowers on her doorstep with note reading, "Mind your own business or this could be you." The subtlety of a brick through a window but with cowardice of anonymous threats. When we filed police reports, Officer Martinez just shook his head and added it to what he called the Whitman file. Apparently we weren't her first victims. But while Patricia was busy playing suburban terrorist, I was documenting everything for additional criminal charges. Every threat, every act of vandalism, every attempt at intimidation was recorded, photographed, and filed with law enforcement. Her lawyer, the college roommate, who'd been enabling this behavior for years, suddenly withdrew from the case when she realized criminal liability. Exposure was too great for civil attorney to handle. The new lawyer immediately tried negotiating plea deal through the prosecutor, offering partial restitution in exchange for reduced charges. I refused any settlement that didn't include full restitution and criminal prosecution. This wasn't about money anymore. It was about justice for great-aunt Dorothy and protection for every future resident who might face Patricia's abuse. The community rallied in ways that restored my faith in human nature. Yard signs appeared overnight reading, "Transparency in HOA Management." Local business owners offered support and alternative meeting venues. A retired police officer volunteered security expertise for the upcoming confrontation. As the annual meeting approached, Patricia's desperation reached nuclear levels. But every desperate move she made only strengthened our case and unified the community against her. She was about to learn that terrorizing your neighbors works fine until they stop being afraid and start getting angry. Patricia's final meltdown began when she realized criminal charges weren't just possible, They were inevitable. The FBI Financial Crimes Unit had started making inquiries. The state attorney general's office was building a case, and her own attorney had basically fired her for being too toxic to represent. Her response was to attempt what I can only describe as strategic retreat to Crazy Town. She tried fleeing to her sister's house in Utah, apparently believing that crossing state lines would somehow make federal mail fraud charges disappear. Unfortunately for her master plan, the court had frozen her credit cards as part of asset seizure, and her Lexus broke down somewhere outside Denver. Nothing says criminal mastermind like getting stranded on I-25 because you can't afford a tow truck. When she slunk back to Maplewood Gardens 48 hours later, looking like she'd been living in her car, which she probably had, neighbors were watching from windows like witnessing the world's least competent fugitive returning from failed escape attempt. That's when she made her most desperate move yet. Direct bribery attempt that was so clumsy it would have made mob movie extras cringe. She showed up at my door at 10:30 p.m. with a duffel bag containing $45,000 in cash, claiming it was restitution for any inconvenience I'd experienced. The woman actually used the phrase, "Let's put this unpleasantness behind us," while offering me a bag of money like some suburban crime boss. What she didn't know was that I was wearing a wire for the FBI. Agent Rodriguez had suggested it after Patricia's failed escape attempt, and apparently my property management background made me a natural for undercover work. The recording was beautiful. 42 minutes of Patricia confessing to borrowing HOA funds, admitting to creating fake assessments and explaining how she'd been creative with accounting to fund her lifestyle. My personal favorite moment was when she said, "You understand how these communities work, right? The residents are sheep who need someone to make decisions for them." I was providing a service. The FBI agent listening through my earpiece probably broke a pencil from gripping it too hard. The attempted bribery added another felony to her collection. But more importantly, it gave us a confession that would make prosecution absolutely bulletproof. She just handed the federal government enough evidence to lock her up and throw away the key. Meanwhile, community solidarity had reached levels that would have made union organizers weep with pride. 39 of 53 households were now openly supporting our rebellion, with only 6 holdouts, all owned by Patricia's relatives or people who owed her money. The community fund we'd established to help elderly residents with legal fees had grown to $14,000, mostly from small donations that proved our neighbors were willing to put their money where their principles were. The local restaurant owner donated catering for the upcoming meeting. The hardware store offered supplies for repairing vandalism damage. Even the postal carrier started reporting suspicious activity around coalition members' homes. Apparently, federal employees take mail tampering very seriously. National attention was building too. The HOA abuse organizations had discovered our story through social media, and suddenly we were getting support calls from communities dealing with similar corruption across the country. The hashtag honored Justice for Dorothy was trending in property management circles, which isn't exactly mainstream fame, but felt pretty good to those of us fighting suburban tyranny. Patricia's professional life collapsed like a house of cards in a hurricane. Her real estate brokerage terminated her contract immediately after the bribery attempt went public. The state licensing board suspended her pending investigation. Former clients started filing complaints about unethical behavior going back years. She filed for personal bankruptcy to hide assets, which only made federal prosecutors more interested in where those assets might be hidden. The supreme irony was that her own house went into foreclosure. The woman who'd been threatening foreclosure against neighbors couldn't make her own mortgage payments once her criminal enterprise was exposed. Karma doesn't get much more poetic than that. Her last stand strategy was pure desperation theater. She planned to claim I was an outside agitator sent to destroy the community, blame everything on the management company, and bring Kevin plus 3 relatives as support to pack the meeting with allies. She even tried recruiting supporters from neighboring HOAs, promising them that outside interference in their communities could be next if they didn't stand together. But while she was scrambling to create the illusion of support, I was putting finishing touches on a presentation that would end her reign of terror permanently. The forensic accountant's report was crystal clear and visually devastating. The attorney's legal analysis identified 14 separate felonies with ironclad evidence. Frank's engineering assessment proved thousands wasted on imaginary infrastructure work. The private investigator's surveillance had caught ongoing financial crimes in real time. The night before the annual meeting, I visited Great Aunt Dorothy's grave one final time. I told her about the evidence we'd gathered, the community we'd united, and the justice we were about to deliver. The August evening was warm and peaceful, fireflies beginning their nightly dance above the headstone. Tomorrow, Patricia Whitman would face the reckoning that Great Aunt Dorothy had started building years before her death, and I was going to make sure every second of it honored her memory. The community center on the morning of the annual meeting buzzed with the kind of electric tension you feel before thunderstorms break. By 6:30 a.m., residents were already arriving with folding chairs and thermoses of coffee, settling in like they were claiming prime real estate for the neighborhood event of the decade. The smell of fresh coffee mixed with nervous energy and the faint scent of floor wax from the community center's overnight. Cleaning 78 residents packed into a space designed for maybe 50, with local media crews setting up cameras in the back, like they were covering a presidential debate instead of a suburban HOA meeting. Rachel Thompson from the newspaper had her notebook ready, and the Denver TV affiliate had sent their investigative reporter. Apparently, HOA corruption was becoming prime-time material. Patricia arrived 15 minutes late in what could only be described as a tactical entrance, flanked by Kevin and 3 relatives who looked like they'd rather be anywhere else on Earth. She'd clearly spent the morning trying to reclaim some semblance of authority, wearing a navy blazer that screamed, "I'm still in charge," and carrying a briefcase that probably contained more legal threats than actual legal authority. Her opening gambit was to immediately seize control of the meeting, citing procedural authority and board prerogatives like some suburban dictator reading from a constitutional monarchy handbook. She announced that the first order of business was removing me from the community for disruptive behavior and threatening community safety. That's when Helen stood up like an avenging angel of parliamentary procedure. "Point of order," she called out in a voice that could probably be heard 3 blocks away. "Under Colorado state law and our own bylaws, this meeting must allow homeowner input before any business can be conducted. You cannot simply remove residents without due process." The room erupted in applause and shouts of support that made Patricia's face cycle through more colors than a mood ring having an electrical malfunction. She tried to restore order by banging a gavel she didn't actually have authority to use. But the crowd was having none of it. I took the floor with the calm confidence that comes from having overwhelming evidence and nothing left to lose. I began with a tribute to Great Aunt Dorothy, explaining how her love for this community had inspired her to spend her final years gathering evidence of corruption that would protect her neighbors from financial predation. The visual presentation hit like a guided missile. Financial charts showing systematic theft of $420,000, before and after photos of promised improvements that existed only on inflated invoices. Audio recordings of Patricia admitting to creative accounting and calling residents sheep who need someone to make decisions for them. The audience reaction was everything I'd hoped for and more. Gasps of outrage when they realized the scope of theft. Audible weeping from elderly residents who finally understood why they'd been targeted. Angry shouts when the racist undertones of Patricia's enforcement patterns became clear. But the moment that defined everything came when Patricia tried to interrupt the presentation. She jumped up screaming about lies and forgeries and conspiracy theories designed to destroy our community. Then she made the fatal mistake of playing the race card, suggesting that neighbors couldn't trust his kind to understand traditional community values. The room went dead silent for about 3 seconds, then exploded in unified outrage. These were people who had lived together for decades, who'd watched each other's kids grow up and supported each other through divorces and deaths and deployments. They knew exactly what Patricia was suggesting, and they weren't having it. The smoking gun moment came when I played the audio recording from her bribery attempt. Her own voice, clear as a church bell, admitting to years of financial manipulation. I was providing a service by being creative with the accounting. These people don't understand how communities really work. Kevin tried claiming the recording was illegal, but my attorney, Catherine Reynolds, was ready with chapter and verse of Colorado law confirming single-party consent for recording conversations. Patricia's face went through what I can only describe as the 5 stages of grief and fast forward. Detective Williams from the Financial Crimes Unit had been observing from the back of the room and stepped forward to announce that formal charges were already being prepared. The FBI was reviewing evidence for federal prosecution. The state attorney general's office was pursuing civil penalties. Patricia's real estate license was permanently revoked. The community vote was swift and merciless. Unanimous removal of the entire board with Patricia and her allies walking out in defeat. Temporary leadership appointed with me as financial oversight chairman. Criminal prosecution approved by acclamation. Independent management company hired to prevent future corruption. As TV cameras captured Patricia's final meltdown, screaming about conspiracies and lawsuits, while Kevin physically restrained her from attacking anyone, I delivered the line I'd been practicing for weeks. My great-aunt taught me that communities are built on trust, not fear. Today we reclaim our community. The standing ovation lasted 5 minutes and felt like vindication for every elderly resident who'd been bullied, every family forced from their home, and every neighbor too afraid to speak up until now. Justice served at exactly room temperature in a community center that smelled like coffee and victory. 6 months later, the headlines told the whole story. Former HOA president sentenced to 4 years. Federal prison for embezzlement and mail fraud. Patricia's guilty plea had come after her new attorney, a competent one this time, explained that fighting the evidence would be like arguing with gravity. Kevin got 18 months as an accomplice, and her nephew's landscaping company folded after the IRS discovered some creative interpretations of tax law that made Patricia's HOA accounting look amateur. The asset seizure recovered $289,000 through bank accounts, real estate holdings, and that ridiculous Lexus that had become the unofficial symbol of suburban tyranny. We used the recovered funds to actually improve the community. Imagine that concept. The pool got professionally cleaned for the first time in years, looking like something you'd actually want to swim in instead of a breeding ground for mutant algae. Monthly HOA fees dropped from $195 to $85, proving that honest management costs significantly less than criminal enterprise overhead. The new playground we built with recovered funds became a symbol of what communities can accomplish when they work together instead of being terrorized by petty dictators. Kids who'd been cited for chalk drawings were now laughing on swings purchased with money their tormentor had tried to steal. Poetry in motion, if you ask me. David's Property Consulting Solutions, my new business, took off faster than I'd expected. Turns out communities across Colorado were dealing with similar corruption. And word spreads quickly in HOA circles when someone actually knows how to fight back legally. I specialized in forensic financial analysis and helping communities recover from board abuse. 27 clients in the first year with recovered funds totaling over $1.8 million. Not bad for a guy who'd been unemployed and homeless 6 months earlier. The ripple effects went national. Colorado passed Dorothy's Law, and okay, they didn't actually name it after my great-aunt, but everyone knew where the inspiration came from. Requiring public financial audits for any HOA community over 25 homes. The legislation included whistleblower protections and criminal penalties for board members who misappropriate funds. Other states started introducing similar legislation because apparently suburban financial corruption was more widespread than anyone wanted to admit. Dorothy's Garden became the heart of our transformed community. We converted the space next to the community center into a memorial garden with her favorite roses, plus a little library where neighbors could borrow tools and share gardening advice. The stray cats still got fed daily. Tradition is tradition, and the community fund we'd established provided scholarships for elderly residents facing financial hardship. Helen appointed herself unofficial community historian, documenting our transformation from fear-based dictatorship to actual democracy. Maria completed her paralegal certification and started a nonprofit organization helping HOA abuse victims across the region. Frank led the infrastructure committee with actual engineering expertise, ensuring that when we paid for improvements, we actually got improvements worth paying for. The second annual Dorothy Memorial Day drew over 180 attendees, including families from neighboring communities who'd heard our story and wanted to see what positive change looked like. Local news covered the transformation, focusing on how ordinary people can create extraordinary change when they refuse to accept abuse as normal. The documentary film crew that showed up last month was particularly interested in the legal strategy we'd used. Apparently our case was becoming a template for HOA reform nationwide. Studied in law schools and cited in court cases from California to Florida. Great aunt. Dorothy would have gotten a kick out of knowing her evidence gathering was being taught to future lawyers. But the best part was walking through the neighborhood on summer evenings, seeing kids playing in yards without fear of violation notices, elderly residents tending gardens without harassment, and neighbors talking to each other instead of hiding behind curtains. The smell of barbecue replaced the stench of fear, and the sound of laughter echoed where there used to be whispered complaints. Property values increased 14%. Turns out honest management and community trust are better for real estate prices than tyrannical enforcement of arbitrary rules. Who could have predicted that? Sometimes the system works, but only when good people stand up and make it work. My great aunt taught me that communities are worth fighting for, and that David can beat Goliath with the right slingshot, evidence, law, and community solidarity. So drop a comment about your HOA nightmare, the good, the bad, and the ugly. Subscribe for more stories about ordinary people fighting extraordinary corruption. Remember, you have more power than you think, but only if you're willing to use it. Next week's story. Karen tried to steal my parking spot. She had no idea I own the entire block. Thank you for tuning in to Community Justice Stories, where neighbors stand up against HOA tyrants and karma comes knocking. If you enjoyed this story, hit that like button, share your thoughts below, and subscribe for more tales of community triumph and real-life neighborhood drama each week.